We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Marguerite Telford, and I'm Director of Communications, and I'm sitting in for Mark Krikorian today. Joining me today is Steve Camarota, the Center's Director of Research. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
Good to be with you.
This week, we published a report by Steve on the foreign-born population, and I think he probably would agree with me that any serious conversation about immigration starts with the numbers. And so that's where we're going to start today. I did look back, Steve, just last night to see when you last spoke about this. And about this time a year ago, you put out a similar report. And the headlines a year ago were foreign-born population skyrocketing, the share of foreign-born of the population off the charts. So tell me, how has that changed, or are we on the same trend?
No, in some sense it hasn't changed. The latest data reflects all the additions that we've had since then, plus the Census Bureau, I won't go into methodology, but has readjusted its estimates of migration, which are then incorporated into its survey data. And then they go out and ask people if they're foreign born, and that's what we're seeing today. This is the January 2025 current population survey. And that survey is the first by the government to be reweighted to reflect what we think is a better picture of migration. And of course, migration in the last few years has been incredibly high, nothing like it before in history.
So is that why you use the CPS survey? Because I must admit, I read a lot of this, but I rarely see another researcher using that.
Well, there's a bigger survey, and in some ways better for measuring the foreign-born, called the American Community Survey, much larger survey. It asks a lot of the same questions. The problem with that survey is that it's released very slowly. So the most recent data we have only reflects the population in July of 2023. So it's more than a year and a half out of date. The second problem is that data hasn't been adjusted yet to reflect what we now know about migration. So it doesn't give us a very accurate, up-to-date picture. The current population survey that we're using here, that's a monthly survey, it's where we get the unemployment numbers from. So it's been asking since 94 about immigrants, that is the foreign-born. These are individuals who are not U.S. citizens at birth. And that survey still has many, many thousands of immigrants in it. So it can give us a pretty accurate picture, and it's way more up to date. But ultimately, you'd want to have the American Community Survey confirm these results once it's updated and once it reflects the new estimates of migration.
So what do the numbers look like?
Well, as you said at the outset, they're record high. So we had a great wave of immigration more than 100 years ago, 1880 to 1920, roughly. And there was a peak both in 1890 and 1910, a little under 15%. Now we've blown past that percentage. And we're at almost 16% of the U.S. population is now foreign born. To put that into some kind of recent perspective, as recently as 1960 or 1970, it was less than 5% foreign born. But now it's tripled. The foreign born share, the number has gone up like 5-6-fold, but the share of the population has tripled, more than tripled over the last half century. And so the impact of immigration, obviously, is way up. Or put it this way, we've never been here before on immigration. We've never tried to assimilate this many people. And the other point I would make is the last time immigration was this high, well, more than 100 years ago, immigration was significantly reduced, first by World War I in 1914, and then by restrictive legislation in the early 1920s. The foreign-born share then fell pretty steadily until about 1970. To remind your listeners, the laws were reformed in the 1960s, and that spurred a lot of legal immigration. Illegal immigration picked up at the same time, and then there were subsequent changes in the law that further increased immigration into the United States. And now we're at a record number and share.
So the foreign-born population continues on that upward trend. So what are the biggest factors driving this increase? Is this the border crisis where we've seen all these millions of people flooding across the border? Is it illegal immigration that has done this to the numbers?
The short answer is yes and no. Without any adjustment for undercount, it still looks like in this survey, more than 5 million growth in the illegal immigrant population in the last 4 years, I should say, and that accounts for 2/3 of the increase. So just taking this data as is, it looks like illegal immigration exploded, and that drove the recent increase in the numbers. But you have to remember that over 70% of all the immigrants in the United States are here legally. There are 38 million legal immigrants of various kinds living in America. So long term, it's mostly legal immigration. The recent run up in the numbers is driven by mostly, but not entirely, illegal immigration, which apparently, as far as we can tell, grew at an unprecedented pace in the last 4 years.
Which shouldn't surprise anybody with what we've been watching on television. How accurate are these numbers? Because it's hard for me to fathom that you can actually count and find all these people. I mean, these numbers must be kind of on the low side.
A fair point, and that's true. But just to give you some idea, if you were to read deep into this report, you'd see some of the biggest growth we see is among Venezuelans. Now, Venezuelans in the United States, that number's like tripled or more than doubled in the last 4 years, as I recall. So we are picking up exactly the kind of growth one would predict based on the border crisis, because we have done a lot to welcome Venezuelans in the United States. And yet they're showing up in the data, even though they're mostly all recent arrivals, and many of them have irregular immigration statuses. And yet this data is capable of capturing that. So that should give you some confidence. Is there an undercount here? Absolutely. As a percentage, the undercounts are probably not huge overall. So it shows 53.3 million foreign-born. Could the data miss 2 million people? Yeah, I think it could. But do I think it's missing 10%, 5 million, 10 million, something like that? No. I think, for one thing, when we try to line this up with administrative data, without going into any detail, it pretty much comports. Not completely. Let me make that clear. So, for example, births in the United States, including to illegal immigrants, are well reported because illegal immigrants, like everyone else, tend to have their kids in hospitals, and they know to register the birth with the state government because their kids will then be citizens. And yet we don't see the birth records totally out of line with the Census Bureau data. And that should give us some confidence that we're doing a pretty good job. The Census Bureau, despite the challenges, isn't perfect, but does do a pretty darn good job.
So it captures the number of Venezuelans who have recently come in, but what other countries are captured in that? Well, I mean, I would be surprised if the largest group wasn't still from Central America.
Right. Particularly what we find is most of the growth, close to 60%, like 55% of the growth is non-Mexico Central America. Put in Mexico and you get closer to 60%. But much of the recent increase in the last 4 years is from Latin America. And that's exactly what we see in border apprehensions. Now, they usually call them border encounters. We also see very large increases in the foreign-born from India, which legal immigration from India is high, and we do see people at the border from India. That accounted for a big share. The Middle East, it's picking up, by the way, a lot of increase in Afghan immigrants. And the United States has a whole series of programs that have supercharged immigration from Afghanistan, and I'm counting them here in the Middle East. And then finally, we see a big increase from China, and we see Chinese nationals at the border. But remember, Chinese legal immigration, both permanent and temporary to the United States, like Indian immigration, is very high. And again, the data is picking that up.
Well, one thing I noticed about your report is you had some great graphs that I think that our audience will like looking at. In this upward trend we talk about, you show a graph that talks about the different administrations. So how do these numbers that we're seeing right now compare with the growth of the foreign born during Trump's first term or even Obama's first and second term? How do those numbers compare?
Yeah, so the foreign born during Obama's 2 years, the monthly growth averaged 65,000 a year. So some big numbers. That's the overall average. During Trump's time, before COVID, the average was 42,000 a month. So you get a sense. In President Biden's administration, the average growth monthly was 173,000. several times the growth rate before. Or put it a different way, over his 4 years, the foreign-born, legal and illegal, grew 8.3 million in this data. In the previous 12 years before that, it had only grown less than 8 million. In effect, you could say we've got more than 12 years of immigration in a 4-year period. So what we've seen in the last few years is a complete break with the past. But we have to remember that even before this massive acceleration, immigration to the United States was growing very rapidly during all administrations.
One thing that was very interesting in your report was you said that the Census Bureau projected 2 years ago that we would reach 15.8 million by 2042. And now here we are, 17 years early, reaching that level. That's horrifying to me. I'm kind of curious how Census Bureau came up with that number that ends up being so incorrect. And also, have they put out any projections since then?
No, just one minor correction. It's not 15.8 million. It's 15.8% of the population.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
that's
the
right.
foreign-born is 53.3.
Yes, exactly. Sorry.
No, but that's fine. Basically, the Bureau had taken sort of the overall trends, both under Obama, but then more recently under Trump. Immigration fell briefly during COVID, and that probably did affect what they thought future immigration would do. They also actually, in their 2023 estimates, there's some other technical things I won't go into. But basically, they looked at prior trends and said, where might we be? And basically, they were completely wrong. That the pace of immigration, even then, I think they were wrong in 2023. Even if we looked at the pre-COVID numbers, I think they were just being way too conservative. Post-COVID, of course, they've been completely wrong. And we've essentially arrived at a place that we, in terms of foreign-born share, that we weren't supposed to get to for another 2 decades. But it still shows that even if we had this surge, that because immigration runs on autopilot in effect, and because the numbers coming in, mainly legally, but also illegally every year, before the current surge were so high, we were going to pass prior records, even making assumptions that are very conservative.
Well, I'm kind of curious whether the Census Bureau will make more projections after being so off this time. Is that something they routinely do? Have they always made projections?
Yeah, but internally, it's not a high priority. The thing that's a high priority is estimating the population as it is now. That's the thing they then use to weight all their surveys. Projections in the future is not something they've done a lot of. And I think the reasons are that it's not as vital to their overall mission of counting the population, trying to estimate the population, and then collecting all this other data, whether it's on trade and business startups or anything else. So projections are done on an irregular basis, but hopefully they'll, adjust things. But let me say this in fairness to the Census Bureau. I think that the Trump administration is actually going to reduce the flow of people into the United States, particularly illegal immigrants. So if you're working on new projections this year and you start looking at some of the most recent data, say by the middle of this year or the end of this year, border apprehensions are down and some other indicators suggest immigration is down. Now you're going to be stuck with the fact that you had 4 years of unprecedented immigration, but the most recent data suggests a decline. What are you going to project for the future, right? In other words, you had a certain trend. Then we had a complete break with that trend for 4 years. Then that trend has now maybe this year, if the administration is successful, now you'll see a break in that trend. So when you do the projections in the future, which trends do you emphasize? That's one reason why I think that they don't prioritize projections, because it is to some extent guesswork.
Well, gosh, all it would take is some small change with chain migration, and that would just multiply and make a big difference. But I'm kind of curious, with the foreign-born numbers being so high, what policy changes, if any, would you suggest? Or do you think Trump is doing all the right things to actually bring these numbers down?
Well, I think enforcement obviously has a huge impact. One, it'll deter people from coming, right? So on illegal immigration, we've already seen, even at the end of the Biden administration, they took a few tentative steps and apprehensions, or I should say what they call encounters at the border, dropped a lot. So that's one. Two, interior enforcement, again, reduces incentives for people to come. Three, it sends more people home through deportation. 4, it also will cause more people to say, well, I don't want to get caught up in enforcement. I was thinking about going home. I'm going to head back home anyway. So the administration's approach, whether it's getting more cooperation from Mexico, trying to use more detention and more expedited removal and quickly adjudicate asylum claims, whatever it is, go after the, employers, illegal immigrants who are working here. All of those things will clearly reduce the legal immigration component. But I guess I would say that, look, and the Trump administration is right to try to enforce the border and have interior enforcement. But I would still argue that the fundamental problem is that policymakers never grapple with the sheer scale of immigration, legal and illegal. Thinking about immigration policy without regard to the overall numbers is like budgeting without ever thinking about how much money you're going to spend. And I think that every time the whole legal immigration system, which is extremely high, more than 1 million people are given green cards. That's permanent residency each year. And we have hundreds of thousands of people come in on long-term temporary visas. Many of them eventually get green cards too. That's the foreign students, guest workers, cultural exchange. These programs have proliferated in the last 2 decades as well. So there's not much consideration on what is the absorption capacity of American schools and hospitals? What is the absorption capacity of the American labor market? And what is the cultural, ability to assimilate this many people? Look, one of the ways assimilation works, right, is that the preponderance of the native born and their kids, sort of make the acquisition of American language and culture and identity more or less a foregone conclusion because the immigrants represent a modest share of the population. But these numbers suggest that dynamic can change. In a report we put out not that long ago, and it'd be higher now, we found that on average, students in public schools from immigrant households were living in an area in which nearly 40% of all the other students were also from immigrant households. And this changes the dynamic of assimilation. And these numbers suggest that's changed even more. And yet it's almost impossible to find a politician to think about any of these questions in any kind of systematic way.
Yeah, I guess one of the things we can't really change is the impact on education and healthcare and labor markets is partly due to the fact that it's not like that the immigrants coming in are spread evenly throughout all 50 states. They tend to go to where they know people, where people speak their language, where people can help them get jobs, and they end up inundating one particular area and having a tremendous impact.
Right, of course. Something like 3/4 or 2/3 of all immigrants live in like 6 states. So that's true. Immigrants are spread out. They continue to spread out, and new areas are always being settled by immigrants. So you don't want to miss that. But the fact is, immigrants in the United States, as they have been historically, are pretty highly concentrated. So their impact is somewhat highly concentrated as well.
Well, and it's true everywhere. When I lived out of the country, it was the same thing. All the Americans, like in Paris, they all lived in a little suburbia so they could all be together and they all have their kids together in school and speak their own language. Everyone does it. So while you're talking about impacts of immigration, let's talk about the labor force. That's something you talk about a lot. You've done several reports on. What are the key economic effects of a rapid increase in immigrant workers?
Right. So the first thing to keep in mind is immigration does increase the supply of workers. But herein lies another important fact. Immigrants are not just things. They're not just factors in production. As there was supposedly an observer in Europe once said about immigrant workers, they said, we asked for workers and they sent us men. And this is a key point. Immigrants are people. And as such, they have a wide-ranging impact on society. They don't just show up at the workplace and then leave. They're human beings. As such, they are entitled to be treated in certain ways. And the other point I would make is only about 60% of all immigrants are actually workers. And there's nothing strange about this. In any human population, you have caregivers, you have disabled people, you have children, you have old people, you have people, for whatever reason, don't wish to work or can't work. And so, yes, immigration adds millions of workers. Almost about 32 million immigrants now work in the United States. But it also adds tens of millions of non-workers as well. Immigrants comprise in this data, it's 19.7% of all workers in the United States. a little less than 7 percentage points of that, or a little more than a third, are illegal immigrant workers. And I think there are benefits to that, right? One of the big benefits of immigration is that you increase the supply of workers and you push down wages. And those wages don't vanish into thin air. They are either retained by employers or maybe given out to consumers. But the American workers who compete with immigrants will tend to be the poorest and least educated. And an immigration policy will tend to make them significantly poor. And you have to decide whether you think that is good public policy. And the reason, one of the big concerns in the U.S. labor market is the significant increase in U.S.-born men who don't have a college degree, but they're working age, 16 to 64, say, who are not in the labor force. And this trend is extremely troubling for a variety of reasons that I'll explain, but let me go through a couple of numbers quickly. What we've seen just since 2000 is it used to be that about 20% of these working age, non-college educated American men were not in the labor force. Again, neither working nor looking for work. Now it's about 28%. So a very big increase. Back in the 1960s, actually, the percentage was in the single digits. So as immigration has increased since the 1960s, because that's when the law was reformed and immigration was liberalized, we've seen a deterioration in labor force participation among U.S.-born non-college men. And without going into much detail, there's a huge body of research showing this is very destructive both for society and these men. This decline in work is linked to everything from opioid addiction to suicide to political alienation and crime. Men who are idle tend to be self-destructive and they tend to be destructive towards society. If we could just restore the labor force participation of these less educated men to what it was in 2000, not that long ago, it would add nearly 5 million more workers to the U.S. economy. About immigrants, I should add that of that nearly 32 million immigrants working in the United States, well more than half don't have a college degree themselves. And when you look at immigrants across the labor force, as we do in this report, they tend to be concentrated, by no means exclusively, in the jobs done by Americans who don't have a lot of education and who don't make a lot of money. And that, I think, is a concern, but it apparently has not been much of a concern for policymakers.
Are there specific industries that have been more affected? I know when I talk to people on the lower end, they seem to think that a vast number of illegal immigrants are working in agriculture, which just isn't true. And then the other thing on the higher end, they seem to think that the legal immigrants, that a vast number of them are all working in STEM. What kind of jobs have been, or what fields have been affected the most by immigration?
Right. So the main thing, or the biggest thing immigration tends to impact, is the lower wage labor market, but by no means is that exclusive. Immigrants tend to be concentrated in occupations that don't require a college degree, or that's where they tend to have their biggest impact. But, that's not so surprising. People without a college degree make up a very large share of all workers in America. So building, cleaning, and maintenance, construction jobs, installation and repair, food service and food processing, some types of production like meat and poultry processing, they tend to be large shares there. And also healthcare support, not the doctors, not the nurses, but the assistants and aides. That tends to be areas where there's a lot, immigrants make up the largest share of workers. In addition, as you pointed out, to agriculture. But agriculture is only a tiny fraction of our 160 million person labor force. Generally speaking, less than 1% of all Americans, immigrant, just overall, work in agriculture because it's just not a big sector anymore. It was 100 years ago, but not now. And of all immigrants, only a small 1, 2, 3% work in agriculture, again, because it's a small sector. The best estimates I've seen for illegal immigrants is maybe 4% of all illegal immigrants work in agriculture. And that seems right. Again, what that reflects is the size of the sector. Immigrants do make up a lot of workers there, but the sector itself is so small that it doesn't account for many immigrants overall, or even many illegal immigrants. So I think that's the thing to look at and think about the most, that you don't want to think about immigration as agriculture. In fact, the most atypical worker, because it's not a big sector, is an immigrant agricultural worker. The vast majority of immigrants work either in skilled occupations, some significant number in STEM. About 29% of all STEM workers in the United States are foreign born. Now, there are a bigger percentage in construction and some other areas like building, cleaning and maintenance and food preparation and food service, but they are a big percentage of STEM workers. So that's an area where they might have a big impact. But just to remind your listeners, our immigration system isn't designed really to select skilled people who are going to work in STEM. Our legal immigration is mostly family-based or humanitarian-based, that is refugees and asylees. And of course, illegal immigrants tend to be the least skilled. So we have relatively few illegal immigrants who get STEM jobs.
Steve, you've done an extensive amount of research and reports and blogs on the foreign-born population and the jobs, the impact. Is there anything that you found that surprised you this time? And is there any reports you've done recently that you'd like to share with us?
Well, we put out a report a few weeks ago looking at the declining educational attainment of recent arrivals with some earlier data. We averaged several months together to get the most robust statistical estimates. And what we found was that at the end of last year was the first time in, maybe a decade and a half, that the number of immigrants who are newly arrived, because the survey asks, when did you come to the United States? Of newly arrived immigrants, we found that more of them, more than 40%, like 45%, didn't have any education beyond high school. And it was more than the percentage who had a college degree. And this is the first time that's happened in a long time. And the likely cause mostly is the influx of illegal immigrants, which even before the data was readjusted and we looked at it in January, even at the end of last year, illegal immigrants were making up a bigger share of new arrivals. And this is pulling the overall educational attainment down. And one of the things we've already covered this means is that it increases the job competition at the bottom end of the labor market. Now, that's very pleasing for employers, but it means also that it'll reduce wages and something else at the bottom end. And that something else is it makes us increasingly indifferent to the plight of less educated, particularly men who are out of the labor force. After all, why care about all these people on the economic sidelines and all the social problems? I guess we can kind of ignore that too, when we have all these eager immigrants who want to work. My view is we are not going to address this huge problem of non-working, working age men unless we have less immigration and we have an incentive to address it.
So what do you just say when people say to you, oh, those are jobs Americans won't do? The reason is just because Americans are lazy or whatever reasons that they just don't want to do these jobs.
Yeah, I think that the fundamental problem with that argument is that we can do detailed analysis. With that other survey I did, I've already done it. And so you can really drill down because the survey is so big. But even in this data, we have some data on that as well. And we report on it here in this report. And look, there virtually are no jobs that aren't majority native born. Even jobs that you might be surprised. Construction labor, chauffeurs and taxi drivers are still half U.S. born. Maids and housekeepers are still half U.S. born. To suggest, and others, like I said, like meat and poultry processing workers or construction laborers, they're 2/3 U.S. born, very roughly speaking. If I were to say to you, a job is 2/3 or half comprised of women, say, and then I said, look, women never do that job. They're just totally uninterested in that job. You'd say I was crazy. You'd say, didn't you just tell me women are half or 2/3 of the workers? But that's exactly the argument we make on immigration. The majority or at least half of workers, even in these least skilled, lowest paid jobs, are still U.S. born. And yet people still say things like, oh, no American does that job. No American wants that job. It's extremely elitist. When people say that, to be honest, what they're really saying typically is, as a college educated, higher paid, more skilled person, that's not a job I would ever be interested in. But the fact is, it is what your fellow Americans, millions, tens of millions, actually do for a living.
Well, now we're kind of coming to an end of the podcast today. So I do want to go back to the numbers of the foreign born. How quickly do you think the Trump administration can actually impact these numbers?
Well, I think initially, like anything else, it's like going on a diet. You can often get the weight down. The first few pounds you lose is the easiest. So there are all these people out there who may be thinking about going home and then saying, well, they're enforcing the law, so they go home. And there were people who were thinking about coming, but weren't sure. Now, once they see that the border's more patrolled, the policies have changed, they're not coming. So I think you're going to have a big effect immediately, and we'll see more people going home, and more people will eventually be removed or deported. So I do think we'll see a decline in the numbers, and that'll be really interesting. We always have to be cautious, though, that any decline we see in the data might be due to people just being unwilling to say they're foreign-born in the data. So we're going to have to be cautious of that in the context of robust immigration enforcement. But that said, I think they can make a huge difference. If I had to guess, let's say in this report, if I do a slight undercount adjustment, there are 16 million illegal immigrants in the United States, and maybe it's higher. But I would say that could they cut the illegal population by 4 million in 4 years? Yeah, I think they could. It wouldn't be mostly removals. It would just be people going home. And finally, and this is the truth, and your listeners always need to remember this, the reason that the illegal population doesn't grow as fast as you might think in particular is because not only are people always going home, and there is a certain amount of mortality among any human population, but we legalize a whole lot of illegal immigrants every year when we give them asylum or when they marry an American or another family member sponsors them. And that actually shrinks the illegal immigrant population as well. It's the new additions that then add to it. And all births in the United States, as under current law, do not add to the illegal population. They're all counted as native born, and they're certainly not illegal under the current interpretation of things. That could change, but that's not the way it is now. So do I think the illegal population, again, could fall by 4 million during the Trump administration? I do. But, I think the illegal population grew 5 or 6 during the Biden administration. So we're still not going to be back to square one. We would need to reduce the illegal population by 6 million during the Trump administration to just get back where we were when Biden took office. That's a tall order, not impossible, especially when you consider all the people going home on their own because of the robust enforcement. But it's an open question. I think that the foreign-born number and share will fall slowly over time, at least during the initial parts of the Trump administration. But long-term, the enormous number of legal immigrants will continue to come, and we'll have to see what happens with legal immigration.
So, thank you so much for joining me today, Steve. I want to be respectful of listeners' times, but I hope that our listeners will go read your report on the foreign-born population.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Steve, for taking the time to sit down and talk about your new report. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Mark Krikorian will be back next week, and I hope you will be too.